everyone. We'll get started in just another minute. We'll give folks some time to trickle in. Thanks for being here on time. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Nicole, and I serve as the community manager for Opportunity at Work STARS Public Sector Hub. Today's topic is find the most qualified candidates by putting skills first. And we are excited to co-host this session with our partner, the Cicero Institute, which is a nonpartisan policy organization that works on federal, state, and local policy issues and is committed to fixing broken systems in the public sector. In just a moment, you will see a quick poll pop up on your screen. We'd love to get a sense of who's here in the room and how you found out about this event. So please take a moment to fill out the poll. And today's agenda includes a brief overview of Opportunity at Work and the STARS Public Sector Hub. Then we'll turn it over to the Cicero Institute team for a panel discussion where you'll learn more about their work. And they've also invited a special guest, Joe Farron, who is formerly the Chief Strategy Officer with the Maryland Department of Labor. And he'll be able to share some lessons learned from their groundbreaking work that happened at the state of Maryland to remove degree requirements from thousands of their job openings, which inspired 20 additional states to take actions to implement skills-first practices. And throughout this webinar, you can feel free to type your questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. The Cicero team will be lifting up those questions from that at the end of the presentation. And also know that this webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a copy of the recording and other meeting assets afterwards. All right, so here is a brief overview of our mission at Opportunity at Work. We are a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that STARS, or workers skilled through alternative routes rather than a bachelor's degree, can reach their full potential. And STARS represent a substantial talent pool of over 70 million individuals across the US. STARS have developed their skills through pathways like community college, military service, workforce training programs, or by gaining experience directly on the job. And in the public sector alone, STARS play a crucial role with over 9 million STARS working in federal, state, and local government. And of course, we'd love to see this number grow even more. And that's why we're here to support you with skills-first strategies and resources to help you tap into this talented group of workers. And towards that end, 6 months ago, we launched the STARS Public Sector Hub, which is a digital resource hub designed specifically for leaders across local, state, and federal government. And the hub offers valuable resources with our data, research, and narrative design tools. And beyond that, it also serves as a learning community. So it's a network where public sector leaders can learn from one another about advancing skills-first practices and leveraging STAR talent. So if you're not already a member, we encourage you to join the hub to gain full access to our exclusive events and stay updated on the latest tools and resources. We'll include a link in our follow-up email. And membership is free, and any public sector employee is welcome to join. For those not working in government, nonprofits also have the opportunity to join us as partners. There's a brief interest form on our website. We review those quarterly to ensure alignment with our mission to drive skills-first practices in the public sector. So again, if you haven't joined yet, now's the time. Sign up for the hub. And as part of the hub, we host a series of regular webinars and office hours to create space for community gathering. We really value your input and feedback about what your interests are so that we can provide the content and resources that you need. So here are some of the upcoming events that we have. So on December 5th, we'll host a follow-up office hours to today's webinar. We're bringing back today's speakers, an opportunity to ask deeper questions with our subject matter experts more informally. You'll also meet other members of the Hub community, and you'll receive an invitation to sign up in our recap email tomorrow. And then in January, we're hosting an event on skills first strategies in the new administration. We'll be partnering with JFF, Jobs for the Future, and the Volcker Alliance. So more info to come on that event soon. And here are the incredible people you're going to be meeting shortly during our panel. So from the Cicero Institute side, we have Michael Brickman, Education Policy Director and Senior Fellow, Stacy Goober, Visiting Fellow, and Jonathan Wolfson, Chief Legal Officer and Policy Director. We are also honored to have Joe Farron, former Chief Strategy Officer with the Maryland Department of Labor. And so now I'll pass it to Jonathan and the Cicero team to open up the panel.
Well, thanks, Nicole, and thanks to the Opportunity Network team for putting this event together. Thank you, all of you who have joined today, for joining, and everybody who's watching the video afterward. We are excited to share some of the things we've seen as we have worked on this policy across the country, and some of the lessons that we all have learned in the work we've been doing on this policy. Before I came to Cicero, I had the privilege of working on some of this policy work at the U.S. Department of Labor, where I was for a couple of years before I joined Cicero. We are going to do a quick kind of run around the table and let you meet the rest of the panelists in a little more detail. And I just want them to talk a little bit about how they came to the issue of skills-based hiring and how they wound up working on it and the sorts of things they've had the opportunity to do. So, Stacy, we're going to start with you.
Thank you so much. My name is Stacy Goober. I have been with the Cicero Institute for about 3 years. I focus solely on our workforce development, removing degree requirements reform. Prior to coming to Cicero, I was actually in the private sector for about a decade in financial services and strategy consulting. So I actually first came to this issue when I saw that former Governor Larry Hogan, who Joe can talk a little bit more about after, passed this in Maryland, and I was just so intrigued by what he was doing, how impactful this type of reform could be. And I thought that we could just do some more research, help craft policies, and help this policy have more of a reach. And so I've been working on it ever since.
Thanks, Stacy. Joe, tell us a little bit about how you showed up and started working on skills-based hiring.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And Stacy, thank you for the shout out. Many years ago, I started my career in the legislature in New Jersey. And it's really where I fell in love with state government and realized how much you could accomplish and really impact people's lives at the state level. And then I had a terrific opportunity to work in the Hogan administration. As you said, Jonathan, as a chief strategy officer at the Maryland Department of Labor, where I was able to play an important role in helping Maryland almost 3 years ago now, it's hard to believe, become the first state to remove the 4-year degree requirement from thousands of jobs. And really quick, we were just looking at a ton of data, and it was just jumping off the page at us at how many Americans were qualified, were skilled, but they were bumping up against this unnecessary requirement. And the response when we move forward in March of 2022 has really been incredible.
Thanks, Joe. And last but not least, Michael.
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, as you know, because we worked in the federal government together, there was this issue. I was working at the U.S. Department of Education, and we were trying to encourage private sector employers to hire based on skills and competencies, not just based on whether or not you had a 4-year degree. And eventually one of those employers pulled me aside and said, yeah, the federal government is probably the worst actor on this, and they're the largest employer in the country. And I said, that's a fair point. So we got a little group together. Jonathan was part of it. We had people from bunch of different agencies in the White House, and we eventually put together an executive order that President Trump signed that removed college degree requirements for all federal civilian jobs in June of 2020. And I gotta say the response was electric. Sorry, did I say electric? What I meant was no one paid attention because it was right in the middle of COVID. It got almost no attention outside of like the federal government, specialty insider news blogs, and just kind of sat there. And there wasn't a lot of progress until you started to see the states take action. You saw groups like Cicero and groups like Opportunity at Work pushing this with private sector employers and pushing it with states. So I'm so thrilled to see it. And on a personal note, got to be a constituent of Governor Hogan's for just a little bit when we moved from DC to Annapolis, and got to see all the good work that people like Joe and the Hogan team were doing in there.
Thanks, Michael. So just a real quick introduction before we dig too deep, just to let folks know. So the Cicero Institute, as Nicole mentioned, is a nonpartisan think tank. We focus mainly on state policy, although we've interacted on the federal level and local level as well. And we've had the opportunity to work with a number of state legislatures and with state governor's offices to pass and to begin implementation of skills-based hiring. And, really that has been fascinating to see. This is one of those issues that stretches across party lines. It stretches across a lot of divides in politics. And, it's one of those things that whether you are President Trump or candidate Kamala Harris, you are in support of. And it's one of the few executive orders that Michael and I and others on our team worked on that President Biden kept in place when he entered office. And they did do some work to try to implement, again, behind the scenes. And really the states have taken a lead. And to Joe's point, really the states create really great opportunities to make big changes, and the states really have the bandwidth to address these issues. And so you've seen executive orders in Virginia and in Pennsylvania, you've seen legislation in Florida and other states. And so this is one of those issues that no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you've got Gavin Newsom and Ron DeSantis in full agreement that this is an important issue. So we're going to dig in a little bit and talk in more detail about what is skills-based hiring and some examples of policy design from the state and federal level. So Joe, can you talk a little bit about how was skills-based hiring introduced and implemented in Maryland?
Yeah, no, Jonathan, absolutely. I thought about this a little bit and have come up with really four key areas that move this from an idea to a policy in really a short period of time. And the first one is executive commitment and buy-in, right? When Larry Hogan decided we're going to do this, this is going to be the policy of the state of Maryland. And by doing that, every single one of his cabinet members were engaged, made it a priority, and made sure it scaled throughout the entire state government when implemented. So that was a really, really important piece to have someone like Governor Hogan engaged, bought in, and making sure it gets implemented. Second, and again, this was 3 years ago, we had a great partner in Maryland, and that partner was Opportunity at Work. And having them as an expert resource, but also as a, Opportunity at Work has a pool, an enormous pool of stars that were able to look at our jobs after they changed, apply for them, and get jobs. So having them along the way from the very beginning as an advisor, as a counselor, was a critical part of our success. The third piece is the personnel department and making sure they have a really great plan and process for changing all of the job requirements that fall under this policy so that you remove the 4-year degree. But of course, there are still requirements about skills and experience that need to go into those applications. So having a really engaged and skilled personnel department with a plan and process was critical. And then the last piece is great technology. Easy to access portal. When we announced this, anybody could go right on our portal and look up every job that was currently available in Maryland, the state of Maryland, that did not require a 4-year degree. So it was super easy to use. It was available on day one, and people started applying right away.
Thanks, Joe. Michael, talk a little bit. You mentioned how the response originally was not great to the executive order, right? There was not a groundswell of national support. People's focuses were on other things. But talk a little bit about kind of the impetus behind the federal decision, and then also some of the work that was going into implementation, even though it wasn't being heralded across the country, and did lay groundwork for states like Maryland and other states as they have advanced this reform in their states.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it's not that the response was bad, it's just that there wasn't much of a response. It was just crickets. And I think what that told us initially, and I think we got the right message from this, is people are not going to care until you actually start hiring people who have different educational backgrounds. And so what we kind of volunteered to do at the Department of Education was start to roadmap this to figure out, how do you actually structure this? HR can be difficult. Government HR is crazy difficult. And we had to start building the case for change management. I think, unfortunately, some of that work got a little bit derailed with the change in administration. Not really anybody's fault. It's just, this was an administration priority in the last administration. As you said, Jonathan, the Biden-Harris administration continued it, but it may not have been as high profile as a priority. It wasn't their idea. They might not have had people in the White House, or anywhere else really focused on it. So, I think it just kind of was implemented slowly. The Office of Personnel Management has put out some guidance, but not anything earth-shattering. There's a lot more that needs to be done well, we can talk about some next steps later, but I think it's really imperative that there be follow through here. And, not to kick her while she's down, but, I was really happy to see Kamala Harris make this a priority on the campaign trail. And in fact, she said that it would be her first day one priority. And I think that's the only policy she said that about, that this is the one thing she would do day one. And that was great. But I think it tells you that it wasn't exactly a top priority within the administration, because she seemed, in the way she was talking about it, not to know, and her team didn't know, that this was already the existing policy. And so I love that it's bipartisan, but we got to get the word out there and make sure that everybody knows about this, including presidential candidates, because otherwise you're not going to get the change that you really need. And even at the state level, when you see a change in administration, you might not get it carrying through to the predecessor. Even if it does on paper, you might not be able to carry the momentum forward.
Thanks, Michael. Stacey, talk a little bit about what we are doing at the state level at Cicero, working with partners like Opportunity at Work to really drive this reform, not just as a thing that someone signs or claims to have signed or thinks about or puts in a bill, but actually, goes about putting this on the books to really try to make a change. What have we been doing, and what have we seen the states doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're kind of working on two fronts. So we are helping craft policy. We develop model bills, model executive orders. So the actual legislations that state legislators can then take and share with other legislators and make sure it gets passed. But at the same time, we're also working on implementation and guides for how everyone can implement this successfully. We know, as everyone alluded to so far, that this is an arduous task, right? It seems really simple when you talk about it, just everyone, let's shift to merit-based hiring and skills-based hiring. But it requires the individuals, the hiring managers, to think differently about the candidates they're hiring in. It requires them to do more work than just checking the box and advancing a candidate to the next step. And so what we've developed is not only from the policy perspective, that angle, but also this guidebook that we can kind of walk through and almost be kind of like a trusted advisor to these states and to everyone working throughout this process. There are a lot of stakeholders, a lot of different people at so many different levels that Joe mentioned, that need to be bought in, right? They need to understand the importance. Why is it important to them? Why is it important to their department? Why is it important to everyone around them? And so what we're working to do is help everyone understand that, help everyone realize how they can work together so that this can be really successful. And then also what we'll kind of talk about later on is how to measure success, right? Because we want to make sure that people are putting pen to paper. We've seen so many times recently that an executive order will be passed, but then nothing happens, right? And so that's why we're also working on the legislation to make sure that executive orders are being codified, and then implemented correctly.
Stacey, talk for a second about the Cicero model of how we have, using the C4 organization that we have, the ability to work directly with those governors, with those legislators, to not only kind of introduce them to the concept, but help them get those reforms across the finish line.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got our policy team that's separate from the C4. The C4 team works directly with state lobbyists, and they can communicate with the state legislators to make sure that we're all kind of working hand in hand on communicating the importance, for why different reforms should be passed. It's not only about saying why, but also helping the state legislators to understand how to explain this to other people, to their constituents. And so it takes a number of people to be involved in this, right? We've got everything from our research, from our policy team, that are crafting all this, and then all the way over to implementation. At the policy level where we are and where I'm seated, we are working with all the different actors. And so we are helping to ensure that everything that we're working on, is being communicated and implemented successfully.
Thanks, Stacey. As everybody has mentioned, implementation is obviously an important piece. You know, we've seen these both legislation and executive orders in more than 20 states. We're about halfway there with the whole country thinking this is a good idea. There's been federal legislation proposed to address federal contractors, and there have been conversations about codifying President Trump's executive order and all of those things. But as I think everyone has alluded to, and I think that everyone who's joining us today can attest, just because the states or the federal government put a law on the books doesn't necessarily mean that all of the hype and hope about that can go into place. So let's take a few minutes and talk a bit about implementation. And Joe, I'd like to have you start a little bit talking about what were Maryland's implementation steps, and then what were some of the challenges that you faced along the way?
Yeah, no, Jonathan, I think this is a really important question. And I think in the beginning, when we started talking the opportunity at work, you know, the idea was to try to just put a something on our website at the Department of Labor that would attract more stars to jobs. And then, you know, we both collectively just started digging into this issue and thought, wow, we really have a bigger opportunity. And then we just thought, you know, we have a responsibility to expand economic opportunity for this giant pool of workers. So I think as soon as we got to that point and the governor said, we're doing this, from there, everything did get a lot easier. I would say the most difficult pieces were at the Department of what we call Budget and Management, personnel. And let me be very clear, they did an amazing job, but they had a really big job. And that was changing essentially every job application, or I should say, you know, job outline, to make it so non-degree candidates could apply. So that was a big undertaking. And of course, not every job became eligible for non-four-year degree. So they had a really big role to play and a lot of responsibility in deciding which jobs would be eligible right off the bat. And then, making this easy from a technology standpoint. State governments aren't Microsoft, they aren't Google, but they have really good technology professionals. And we were really lucky in that we had a portal that was easy to use. And it was something where if I had skills but not a degree, I could really search through each department. I could search by salary. I could search by issue area and really try to find that role that fit who I was, what I was passionate about, and most importantly, what my requirements or what my experience would be able to get me into an interview. So there were a number of steps along the way, as I said, but it all got a lot easier as soon as the governor said, "Yep, we're doing it," and every cabinet member was on board. And then just getting to work with the personnel department, that was really the biggest lift, no doubt about it.
Michael, you've made a comment earlier about the OPM process and kind of the work that you were doing at the Department of Education. Talk a little bit more about federal implementation, some of the challenges that have faced federal implementation. What are some of the major next steps? And given that, we have an incoming Trump administration that, it was his executive order in the first place, and there will be people likely in his administration in the future who were part of these conversations the first time around. What are the sorts of things that the federal government is and ought to be doing as it's implementing this executive order?
Yeah, so the good news is some of the things have already happened. So what you want to do first is create a competency-based framework for each of the jobs in the federal government. And that's been happening. And it started under the Trump administration. I believe it's continued under the Biden administration. And that's essentially answering this question of what are the skills and competencies you need to have to do the job. And that's not enough, but that's the first step. The second is enforcement, making sure people are actually getting rid of the degree requirements, not just on paper, and then they're still throwing anybody's resume in the trash if they don't have the specific qualifications. But then they need to enact a series of assessments. So there need to be ways to assess whether somebody has those skills and competencies. And yes, sometimes that's going to be a literal test. I think there should be a move back to some form of the civil service exam, but a 21st century version of that. So assessing some of the basic skills, but also some of the job specific skills, and doing that across the federal government. But I mentioned contractors and how it needs to be extended to them. But there's a lot in federal government HR that doesn't really have much to do with degree requirements, but it prevents people who don't know how to work the system and maybe didn't go to a college you've heard of or any college from accessing the system. Federal employees, they'll do things like, they'll only look at the first 50 applications that are submitted because they don't feel like looking at anymore. And then they'll tell all their friends before the job posts, and then you get a bunch of people who know people who apply. Stuff like that, that's very sort of very, very outdated technology. It would blow your mind if you knew how some of this stuff was done. And what you hear from federal employees in agencies like I've worked, but I've also heard it in like very critical roles in the Pentagon. You can't. You have what are called failed searches, which I think like if you're in the private sector, you say, well, what's a failed search? You just keep searching until you find somebody. But no, in the federal government, you get a slate of people that are picked by HR, and you have to pick one of those people. And sometimes it'll be a promotion. And the person who's been like doing the job for the last 6 months and is the best candidate, but they've just been kind of doing it in an acting role and not getting paid for it, they won't even show up in the list of potential candidates. So, I mean, I go on, and I'm sure Jonathan could too. Joe could at the state level. But it's kind of this like government insanity thing that's not really about degree requirements, but it has the effect of denying opportunity to really well qualified people who just don't know how to work the system.
Stacy, talk a little bit about the playbook that we've put together at Cicero and how states are using that in coordination with consultations with Opportunity at Work, with outside organizations, and how our playbook fits into helping folks figure out what questions they ought to be asking and what are the steps along the way.
Absolutely. So what we put together is what I want to call a guide for implementation, right? It's simply outlines all the different steps, as simple as it sounds, but all the different steps, all the different people that need to be involved in implementation. And so that if someone opens it up, if a hiring manager opens up or any other individual, they can see what needs to be involved so that this can be implemented successfully. You have to, from a high level down, right? Define your goals, set your outcomes and deliverables, right? We want everyone to be on the same page so we can say, by the end of the month, let's review the first 100 jobs that are in front of us to see if they require the degree or not. You want to make sure you have those deadlines. You want to make sure everyone knows their roles and responsibilities. We have all touched upon this a few times now, but that is so important because everyone needs to know how they're involved. And it's so crucial that they know what they're going to get out of it, how they're going to benefit, how they're going to be impacted, right? Another perspective to think of from it. As Michael kind of mentioned, you want to think about your skills validation process. There are a number of different terms that you're going to start to hear about when you think about the future of workforce and skills-based hiring, but we have to better assess the different candidates because we're not just checking the box. So we have to think about the best ways to make sure that these candidates are actually skilled in what they say that they're skilled in. And that could be, you start to hear about this, digital resume wallet, for example, and all these other new uses of technology that maybe in the future states can start implementing to make this easier. We have to think about that this is an actual change within the organization. So learning curriculum, right? Skills training programs. Skills training programs, I think, are so important because essentially what we normally associate like apprenticeships and skills training programs are with skilled trades, but they're actually really important for certain roles like executive assistants, people managers. These are different skills that individuals can be qualified for roles, but then just need that extra specific skill set, and that would be so helpful. And then finally, we also need to incorporate how to measure success. Measuring success is so important, understanding key performance indicators so that people can see, what has changed. What has this been effective? How can this be more effective? What else can we do? And because it's such a short time horizon since we went from, 2 states implementing this to now more than 24. It's only been about 2 or 3 years. And so we really haven't seen so many people start to measure success. But as we're working with different states and we're partnering with them, we're trying to encourage them to kind of implement different measures to see how's this been successful? Can we communicate things differently? Because at the end of the day, this is all about hiring the right individual, right? At the end of the day, it's about creating meaningful career opportunities for the individual and also creating a better working environment for the public sector employer.
Hey, Jonathan, I just wanted to jump in really quick here on
Totally.
what Stacy said because it's so important. And certainly to what we did in Maryland, to have a partner like Cicero or Opportunity at Work is absolutely critical, right? Because for most states, this is new, this is different. Frankly, when we did this, I was expecting opposition. I was expecting a big debate. It never came. I was really happy about that. But a lot of the reason probably it never came is we had a really tight program in place. And certainly a lot of that was due to having an expert like Opportunity at Work involved. So I would just strongly advise anyone out there in a state looking to do this, whether it's Cicero, Opportunity at Work, or another organization. It really is a critical piece to being successful.
No, that's a great point, Joe. And one of the things that we've heard, and we heard this at the federal level, we've heard it at the state level, and Joe, you and I've talked about this before. There's a lot of states that had exceptions policies where you could historically have someone who didn't have a degree who could go through a lot of process and prove that they had the skills. But historically, that was kind of to Michael's earlier point, a really arduous process. It required that you go through and demonstrate lots and lots of things. And ultimately, it made it really hard for a hiring manager. You required them to do so much extra work that, short of the person being the world's leading expert in that thing, but not having the degree that supposedly you were supposed to have to do the job, most state agencies, most federal agencies, most private businesses weren't going to pay attention to it. They were just going to say, yeah, we have that process, maybe for the person who's grown up as a person in the company, but the reality is we just haven't gone through it. And I think that one of the things that we've all seen, whether that's through an executive order or through legislation, is the value of changing that default. And having that new default really does allow those hiring managers to know that this is not something they're taking a risk on doing, but it really does give them an opportunity to find those best people. Something that you mentioned earlier, Joe, and I'd love Stacy and Michael to comment a little bit on, is how valuable it was in the Hogan administration for this to be something that Governor Hogan was out front on, and that his cabinet secretaries were out front saying, we are in full support of doing this. And Stacy, I'll let you go first, and then Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts on both at the state and at the federal level, just the importance of getting that senior leadership who are going to say, we actually care about this, not just as something we can get written up in the newspaper about, but really as something we are going to use as our own internal metric of, are we being successful? So talk a little bit about that, Stacy, and then Michael.
Absolutely. So in consulting, we call it stakeholder engagement, but I know that's buzzwords, but it's so true. Making sure that everyone's aligned, everyone's on board is so important. And that starts, the communication goes top down. Everyone at every single level needs to be bought in. It's something that I keep reiterating, because if one person is causing that block and doesn't believe that this is an effective and good thing to implement, then they're just going to cause a block in the process and it's going to fail. You need everyone on board, because you need everyone from the people in the roles, right? Currently, they're moving to other roles. You need to learn from them what makes an individual successful in your role. So you've got individuals that are either manager level or below, and they need to be the ones weighing in on what would make someone successful in my role that would be coming in. You've got the level above them who's in a people manager role, right? To be promoted. You've got the cabinet secretaries. You've got the governor. Everyone has to be aligned with what you're doing and how you are going to be creating change within the organization. The state employee system is just like any other organization, right? Everyone has to be on board. It might be harder to jump through some hoops than at a private company, but at the same time, the processes are the same. The people are the same. You have to make sure that everyone's got that same mindset, that everyone believes that at the end, you're all walking the same direction, trying to reach that same goal. Because you know what? The workforce is changing. What people want is changing. And so hiring that right individual is only going to make your workforce better.
Thanks, Stacy. Go ahead, Michael. Talk a little bit about on the federal level the importance of that leadership, especially given how massive the federal government is.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of talk about deregulation in government right now. I think we need to also deregulate government, because the internal government processes at, I know, many state agencies, and certainly at the federal level, are, as I was kind of saying before, crazy. It's not something that can be easily managed. It's not something that results in a sane, common sense outcome a lot of the time. And that's got to change. There's got to be top-down leadership to get rid of some of the nonsense and some of the, there's this one in a million thing that happened one time. So now we have to have this rule forever until the end of time. You got to get rid of some of that stuff eventually. and allow people to just make common sense decisions. And I think when you do that, then they'll do it. But there's also a little bit of kind of you want to protect yourself. That's kind of the attitude of a lot of people in government sometimes, is you want to not rock the boat, because if you just kind of keep your head down, then you can keep your job and your benefits and all that kind of stuff. And so it is a bit risky to hire people who don't have a degree. And so we need to de-risk that for them. And the way to do that, and I think this also answers one of the questions that I saw in the Q&A from Nicole about how do you make sure those resumes that I mentioned earlier that are just being thrown in the trash, how do you stop that from happening? You do that by putting objective criteria in. And I know, assessments and signaling for off-the-shelf tests or short-term credentials and other things that are already out there, that scares some people. But that is the way to open opportunity to people. I mean, the barriers that have been erected over decades keep people, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, people who don't have degrees, people who come from, not the greater DC area. Those are the people who are not going to have a real shot at getting those jobs, particularly if they don't have a degree. And the way you do that is you have objective measures of, oh, this person's taught themselves all of these IT skills, but they're amazing, we should hire them. Or this person went to a college that wasn't, where my brother-in-law went to school, so I know it, but it's a school I've never heard of, but it turns out they're really good. Or they learned in the military, they learned in any number of other settings. Those are things that really need to be emphasized and rewarded. But the way you protect the staff from making some of these riskier decisions is make it objective, make it clear, have tests, have other forms of assessment.
Joe, can you talk a little bit about that same question? How did Maryland ensure that you didn't have these qualified people's resumes just being thrown out simply because it lacked a degree when they did come across the desk of a hiring manager?
Yeah, and to Michael's point, everyone is still human, right? And it's really why that top-down, as Stacy said, that support from the governor, from the cabinet, down the division heads, and probably most importantly, the HR people in every department and every division. They have to be all bought in. They have to recognize that this is a change that is happening. And let's be honest, it was a monumental change. 3 years ago when we did this, it was really, really different. So are there people that you will encounter that maybe don't want to do it, don't agree with it? Yeah, sure. But when you have, as I said, that support from the leadership, and then it grows, eventually everyone gets on board. But yeah, there is a human element here. You're talking about very big structures and organizations. And sometimes you're going to come across someone who might not immediately be on board.
Thanks, Joe. I think the next question, Stacy, I'd like to start with you. Talking about with skills-based hiring being kind of the new concept and degree requirements not being there, are state agencies, as you've seen, moving now more toward job assessments to determine the skills? And if so, how is that going for them?
So I think that each state is taking a different approach. And there's a number of different providers and opportunities and ways to kind of do this. It is very difficult to assess skills. There's different ways that states have done this in terms of submitting certifications, and others are implementing skills training programs. But I haven't seen one specific program that has been universally accepted by a number of different states. Whereas in each one, we're kind of seeing different approaches being taken to best evaluate the individuals that are applying. I did want to actually point something out just because I think the one thing that we haven't touched upon yet is actually showing how effective skills-based hiring has been. We've been saying that we have to measure success, that it's, been passed in over 24 states, but I want to tout Joe's efforts and remind him of a very important measurement that came about after they implemented this. Maryland saw a 41% increase in non-degree hires over a 3 to 4 month period. That's huge. And I know that we don't have as many figures for other states yet, but it's something that we have to consider when we're asking states to go through this skills validation process and to develop these skills training programs, because this all requires effort. This all requires change. This all requires so much work just to hire that right individual. And that just shows how successful it can be.
Thanks, Stacy. Michael, can you talk a little bit, both at the state and federal level? We're obviously working with a lot of states about kind of the need to use assessments for lots of different jobs.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, government agencies, state or federal, should not try to build these things themselves. It's not gonna go well. They can look at things like structured interviews, and the federal government is moving in that direction. You also want to just stop doing some bad things, like the federal government would assess candidates, and I'm using air quotes. But the assessment was, Jonathan, rate yourself on a scale from 1 to 5. And if you're honest about that, then your resume is going to go in the trash. But if you know the game, you're just going to give yourself all 5s, and your resume will make it to the top of the pile, regardless of whether or not that's true at all. So, that kind of thing, let's be clear about what assessment actually is, and use good ones. Use off-the-shelf assessments. And I think, you can screen for general aptitude. Basically, people have the basic, like reading, writing, and arithmetic skills. And then you can go a level deeper. You can look at kind of the broad, do you know how to manage people? Do you know how to write a memo? Those types of things. And then finally, you can go into the job specific skills. So again, looking at those job specific competencies, how do you actually assess for them? If it's an IT job, is there a off the shelf assessment from, Microsoft or whoever your vendor is, that you can give some of these people? If you are, doing federal grant making, there are federal grant making training programs, in fact. The only problem is, what I saw when I was in government is, you'd require the degree. You'd say, thank you, I'm glad you have the degree, but unfortunately there's no bachelor's degree in federal grant making. So the degree is not actually helpful to this job. And so we're going to go send you to one of these federal grant making training programs. So, utilize what already exists, utilize what you already value, and just make that part of the hiring process. And then, of course, give people multiple ways in the door. So you're not being overtly discriminatory, so that you, hire from lots of different pools of people with short-term training, apprenticeships, military training, all the rest. So lots of doors, but be very clear and objective in how you get through that.
We've got a few more minutes left to hit a couple more questions. So I'm going to try to get through a couple of these. And I know that we probably all could talk for hours on a lot of this. We do have, as Nicole mentioned, we've got office hours coming up in a couple of weeks. And so would love to see more folks there. But Stacy, and then Michael and Joe, real quickly, what's the best way to identify and validate technical skills versus soft skills? That was a good question that we just received.
So I can answer this based on my background, right? Some of the more technical roles that I applied for in the past, I was given actual on-the-job assessments, right? Work on this problem in Excel. If it's technical and you need certain sort of software skills, right? So giving sample tests and assessments to actually see if the candidate knows what they are saying they can do, and then grading them. soft skills and other presentation skills and PowerPoint skills, basically anything that would be important for their day-to-day job, is to ask them to do, see if they can actually do it. And it can be, throughout the process, right? After their interview, after they've said that they can make it to this next level, make sure that they actually can by doing these on-the-job assessments.
Joe?
Michael or Joe? Yeah. Really not my space, Jonathan, but let me quickly, one story that I love telling is I had a partner at the Maryland Department of Budget Management Personnel, and he would tell me all the time, and almost without exception, that the non-degree candidates would always get the highest reviews, and that they were hungrier, they worked harder, their appetite to learn and grow was almost limitless. And then the other one, my boss, the Secretary of Labor, Tiffany Robinson, who was a critical part of making all this happen, she would often get emails from state workers who had been there for years and finally had the opportunity to apply for a promotion that they were so overqualified for at this point because they had been working in state government for 15 years. So while I'm not terribly qualified to answer that question, I wanted to provide that insight and feedback from some of the hiring managers.
Michael, to you.
Yeah, I want to make sure I'm not repeating things I've already said, but there are a lot of practical steps that I think can get us there. And Stacey, I like what you outlined around change management earlier, and I think there's more in terms of practical steps, but just as I was saying a moment ago, very clearly outlining the objective criteria that you're going to use to measure your candidate success, and not having one end all be all assessment, but instead a series of different ways that you can qualify based on your skills and competencies. And some of those are going to be a little bit more objective. Some of those are going to be a little bit more subjective, like leadership and alignment with the mission and things like that. But that doesn't mean for some of those more subjective criteria you can't measure them, or that you should try to come up with some like snake oil fill in the bubbles with the number 2 pencil type test. Like, assessment does not necessarily mean that. There should be some element of objective testing, and like there's right and wrong answers, but there also should be an element of structured interviews, making sure you're being consistent to avoid bias, and that you're aligning your questions to the greatest extent possible with, again, what you've laid out you really care about, the skills and competencies. So structured interviews, things like that can really help. So not one answer, but I think a variety of things that come together as a package. The other thing that's really, really critical is don't hide those from people. Those should be published in job postings, and it should be things that candidates can go out and get in lieu of a degree. And the more those stay stable over time, that's how you create a marketplace for skills. Because if you can say, oh, look, this 4-year degree costs $100,000 and takes 4 years, in the best case. And this training program costs $15,000 and takes about 3 or 4 months, and they lead to the same job. Well, there you go. You're going to start to make some of those decisions, and you're going to actually get more of a pool of applicants a greater pool of applicants who are qualified, who are directly responding to what you're looking for.
Thanks, Michael. We're going to do one last question. I know we don't have a ton of time, but I think this builds kind of nicely from what you just said, Michael. Johnny Lynn asked a really good question about as we are moving toward implementing this nationwide, are there opportunities for skill-based partners and training partners to come to the table with resources for those job seekers and the incumbent workers? This is true both in the blue collar and the white collar space. He was specifically, Crosby was specifically focused on the blue collar space. But Stacey, you want to comment on that, and then Joe, and then Michael will let you wrap it up.
Absolutely. This is something that we're actually kind of looking into a lot at Cicero, because there are so many opportunities to build, as I mentioned, these types of skills-based training programs. And that's where these outside partners can come to the table and help out. They can develop these, it could be 4 weeks, it could be 6 weeks, it could be 3 months programs that can help people at different levels, entry level, middle level, anything from leadership skills, people management skills. They can build these training programs that can be hybrid while the individual is working, if they're at the leadership level or above, or they can be targeted for entry level candidates, and then they can run them so that all different types of individuals that will need these types of skills can enter these programs and be successful. I think that this is a huge opportunity for so many different types of organizations. You can see there are so many organizations that are focused on the future of their workforce and workforce development, that this is an area that's going to keep building, and more programs and more partners are going to be coming to the forefront with ideas and ways to make these successful.
Yeah, can't agree more. Agree 1,000%. And just one example, we were talking about this when I left the Department of Labor. Community colleges really, making tailor-made programs for certain departments, certain jobs, a huge opportunity, and I absolutely think it's going to happen.
Michael, I'll give you the last word.
I'm optimistic. This is something that everybody is now talking about. I started out by saying, hey, this kind of landed without it was the forest. The tree falls in forest, no one hears it, kind of deal. And now everybody's paying attention. Everybody's on board. It's very genuinely bipartisan. Wrote an op-ed recently saying it might be the last bipartisan policy out there. So I'm really excited at this moment. It is happening, but we've got to seize the opportunity. We can't let it pass, because we all know there have been 1,000 different kind of gimmicky education and workforce ideas to come before. We don't want this to be one of them, where it comes and goes and everybody says, oh yeah, remember skills-based hiring? So we got to follow through, and I think we can.
Well, thanks, Michael. Thanks, Stacey, and thanks, Joe, and thank you, Nicole, for hosting us today. And with that, we will turn it over to you to close us out.
All right. As we wrap up, I'd love to say, on behalf of Opportunity at Work, I'd like to express our sincere thank you to the Cicero Institute for co-hosting this webinar. We are truly grateful to Michael, Stacey, and Jonathan, and also to Joe for being such insightful speakers today and sharing your expertise. I also want to extend a big thank you to each of the attendees for your engagement and the questions that you submitted. Please know that a follow-up email will be sent tomorrow with a recording of the webinar, along with a registration link to our December 5th office hours, and then some other resources. And we hope today's session was valuable for you, and we encourage you to complete the post-webinar survey. We'd love to hear your feedback, and we look forward to seeing you at our December office hours and continuing these important conversations. So have a wonderful remainder of your day. Thanks, everyone.